For the first time in decades, Apple doesn't feel untouchable. Many customers report feeling cornered by subscription pushes they never asked for, products that no longer impress, and updates that seem to make devices worse. The latest iPhone was meant to restore confidence, but instead it faced weak sales and criticism over its Apple Intelligence ad campaign. At the same time, Apple's battle with Epic Games over the App Store fueled developer backlash and raised regulatory scrutiny worldwide. Apple traded risk-taking for predictability, and this video will show how that shift created today's problems through product stagnation, the subscription model, and these legal fights. The bigger question is how Apple arrived here in the first place. When Steve Jobs led Apple, the company worked under a very different set of priorities than it does now. Jobs had returned in 1997 through Apple's acquisition of Next, and almost immediately, he set about reimagining the company's future. His push brought the iMac in 1998 and the iPod in 2001, products that didn't just sell well, but redefined how people thought about technology in daily life. Every launch under his oversight was treated less as a way to drive quarterly gains, and more as an opportunity to prove technology could be elegant, useful, and intuitive. Jobs often repeated a warning that Apple should not get greedy, a reminder echoed in countless commentaries about him. For him, delighting customers came before maximizing revenue. And although that philosophy carried obvious risks, it laid the groundwork for products that changed culture as much as markets. Jobs wasn't simply trying to move more computers or phones, he wanted to reshape entire industries. The iPhone created the modern smartphone era. The iPad opened a new category and redefined mobility. At launch, these ideas were doubted, sometimes dismissed outright, but the willingness to bet on concepts people hadn't yet asked for often revealed demand that competitors hadn't recognized. That mindset gave Apple an aura of trust and anticipation, qualities few companies have ever commanded in the same way. After Jobs' death in 2011, the company didn't cast aside this approach overnight. For a time, it looked like the energy of innovation might continue intact. The iPhone matured, the ecosystem deepened, and Apple remained the face of consumer technology. Under Tim Cook, the rewards of this shift quickly showed up on balance sheets. His operational skill turned Apple into an extraordinarily efficient business. Supply chain optimization, consistency of rollout, and disciplined execution transformed Apple into a model of global corporate management. Investors celebrated as Apple became the world's most valuable company, crossing the $1 trillion market capitalization milestone in 2018. Cook's steady hand reassured markets in ways Jobs never sought to, and in terms of financial accomplishment, his achievements were staggering. But while Wall Street cheered, the character of Apple's relationship with its customers quieted. Launch events continued to draw crowds, but the electric sense of surprise faded. New iPhones arrived every year, yet brought refinements more than revolutions. Jobs once pushed his team toward ideas people didn't yet know they needed. Cook ensured those kinds of leaps wouldn't threaten Apple's stability or margins. What appeared as durability from afar became, over the long run, a limitation. Innovation was not absent, but it ceased to be the company's defining core. This doesn't diminish Cook's skill, nor ignore what he's done to steer Apple through unprecedented growth. His focus on discipline and efficiency gave Apple a scale and profitability unmatched in the industry. The difference lies in priorities. Where Jobs measured success through transformative breakthroughs, Cook's Apple leaned on metrics like recurring revenue, services adoption, and stock performance. That calculation made Apple safer, but it also incrementally distanced the company from the spark that once drove its identity. Record profits masked the decline for years, but reliance on incremental updates left cracks that can no longer be overlooked. The brilliance of Apple's financial performance hid the erosion of its boldness, leaving the company vulnerable to the very stagnation Jobs had feared. In Apple's earlier years of breakthrough products, innovation felt like a constant. The iPod transformed how people consumed music. The iPhone redefined what a phone could be, merging communication, internet, and media in one device. The iPad introduced a new category altogether, convincing millions to adopt a product they previously didn't see a need for. With each of these moments, Apple didn't just release an upgrade, it reset what consumers thought technology could do. Major launches carried a cultural weight, and every event was met with the expectation that something truly new was about to arrive. Products like the Apple Watch in 2015 briefly rekindled hope that the company was still capable of defining new categories. Though it never became as central to everyday life as the iPhone, its debut signaled ambition and felt like a step into fresh territory. But once the watch became a staple in Apple's catalog, the flow of new categories slowed. The years that followed leaned increasingly on refinement, and the era of big surprises became less obvious. Keynotes began to revolve around incremental changes. Slightly faster chips, marginally better camera systems, refined chassis designs. These updates mattered, but they didn't excite audiences in the way earlier breakthroughs had. For longtime fans, the thrill that once fueled queues outside Apple stores turned into a routine cycle of mild improvements. The company still executed those refinements with world-class precision, but the sense of invention gave way to reliability. And that raised a deeper question. Is Apple's problem about pricing its products too high, about products failing to inspire, or about a cultural shift inside the company itself? Later in this video, we'll use specific evidence: the iPhone 16's performance, the Apple Intelligence rollout, and marketing missteps, to explore which of these factors is most to blame. The cautious tone became clearer as competitors experimented with concepts Apple avoided. Samsung led the push into foldable phones, delivering designs that sparked debate about the future of mobility. Chinese brands like Vivo and Oppo made advances in camera hardware and computational photography, producing images that reviewers often compared favorably against the iPhone. Oppo and Vivo also pushed fast-charging technology far beyond what Apple offered, with devices capable of going from near-empty to full battery in minutes. While Apple centered its messaging on stability and polish, rivals created a sense of technical daring, an area where Apple had once set the pace. This growing gap came into focus with the new iPhone. Expectations were high that Apple would re-establish its reputation for bold design after years of steady but familiar evolution. Instead, what customers received was a device that put emphasis on polish rather than reinvention. Performance gains were modest, while Apple Intelligence features launched half-formed, leaving users underwhelmed by what had been framed as a leap forward in AI. Early reports pointed to significant sales weakness, a sharp contrast to the explosive demand that once defined iPhone launches. Marketing only amplified the doubts. Apple's ads for the iPhone leaned heavily into polish. Slight design adjustments, rebranded AI features, improved cameras already seen before. But rather than highlighting discovery or transformation, the campaigns repeated the same promises with a strained tone. The Apple Intelligence reveal backfired in particular, sparking backlash across social media for over-promising and under-delivering. In the past, keynote events were cultural markers people gathered around to imagine a new future. Today, the same presentations often prompt consumers to weigh whether the new set of features justifies the cost. Reviewers no longer ask, "What's next?" They ask, "Is it worth upgrading this year?" That shift marks a profound change in how the public relates to Apple's brand. What Apple risks losing isn't just a momentary edge in product design, it's the role of cultural leader that turned its devices into symbols of progress. As the perception of innovation stalls, audiences are beginning to recognize a new pattern. Rather than empowering them with unexpected capabilities, their devices increasingly nudge them toward business strategies. And that reality sets the stage for the next area where Apple's decisions are reshaping its image, not through hardware, but through what it demands of customers after the purchase. Apple's response to slowing hardware growth was to pivot toward services. Music streaming, iCloud storage, Apple TV Plus, Fitness Plus, News Plus, and even game subscriptions were bundled into a growing ecosystem meant to lock customers in with ongoing payments. To investors, this looked like a masterstroke. Services promised recurring revenue that would smooth over the unpredictable cycles of iPhone sales, and Wall Street praised the consistency. Services now contribute billions of dollars each quarter, with the App Store alone anchoring a large share of that growth. Financially, it became one of Apple's greatest achievements. But for customers, the shift has felt much less like progress, and more like a loss of trust. The expansion of subscriptions rarely came across as optional. Features users once assumed were part of the product gradually moved behind monthly fees. iCloud storage, for example, turned what used to be a one-time capacity decision into an unavoidable long-term cost. Music, once something people owned through iTunes, turned into a subscription streaming model that demanded constant payment. Even the phone itself began to lean heavily on prompts to sign up, pushing free trials that quietly rolled into renewals. The friction wasn't always large in dollar amounts, but it showed up everywhere. Features that once were bundled now nudge users toward ongoing charges. Subscriptions turned what used to be ownership and delight into an ongoing relationship defined by bills. Apple's push into entertainment captured this shift on a larger scale. Apple TV Plus was designed as a challenger to Netflix, Disney, and Amazon. The company poured billions into securing star-driven shows and films, but the library remained far smaller than competitors. Customers who tried it often felt the value wasn't in the content itself, but in the way the service was tucked into broader bundles. Most subscribers didn't seek out Apple TV Plus as their central service. It was something folded into packages like Apple One, made cheaper when paired with storage or music people already needed. Engagement grew on paper, but many viewers recognized the tactic and felt less genuine loyalty to the content. Across the ecosystem, this approach repeated. Fitness Plus, Apple Arcade, and News Plus offered polished experiences but were largely sustained because they were packaged in deals. Devices often nudged users with trial offers, followed by automatic billing cycles. Even the iPhone's operating system delivered reminders about how to get more through subscriptions. Customers who once associated Apple with seamless simplicity began to question whether every interaction was designed primarily to generate another recurring charge. Over time, resentment built, not only at the financial cost, but at the way products no longer felt complete without an add-on fee. From Apple's perspective, the strategy works. Services add stability to earnings and protect the company's high valuation even when iPhone demand slows. Investors reward that consistency, and executives cite the expansion of recurring revenue as proof of strategic success. But beneath the quarterly reports lies the cultural cost. Each prompt, each bundle, and each monthly fee chips away at goodwill. Apple's trust with its customers was never built on predictable earnings. It was built on making people feel that their purchase gave them something special, something whole. Now many experience the opposite. Devices are incomplete, requiring ongoing payments to unlock their full potential. For loyal Apple fans, that shift cuts deep. Steve Jobs once emphasized bringing joy and simplicity to technology, ensuring users felt they were gaining meaningful value at the moment of purchase. The services model undermines that history. Instead of a straightforward exchange of money for innovation, customers see a business model where products arrive with hooks that turn them into subscribers. Some accept this simply as the reality of the modern digital economy. Others see it as proof that Apple has strayed too far from the principles that made it distinct. The irony is clear. Apple built stability in its revenue model. At the same time, it introduced instability in customer loyalty. Subscription prompts make people cautious rather than excited. Services boost Wall Street's confidence, but dampen consumer enthusiasm. Apple's control over the App Store gave it one of the most profitable positions in the technology industry. Every app download, subscription, and in-app purchase on iPhones and iPads passed through systems Apple controlled, and the company claimed up to a 30% commission. For years, this model was unquestioned. Developers had no official alternative, and customers trusted the App Store as a safe, curated space. But as the money poured in, resentment grew, especially from firms and creators who saw Apple taking an outsized share simply because they had no other choice. For small developers, losing nearly a third of every sale could determine whether their projects survived. Larger companies saw billions in potential revenue flowing away. Music streamers, gaming publishers, and productivity tools alike felt constrained by rules that seemed less about protecting users and more about collecting tolls. What had once been described as stewardship now looked more like gatekeeping. Apple had positioned itself not only as a curator, but as a landlord, charging rent to anyone who wanted to reach its customers. The breaking point came in 2020, when Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite, launched a direct payment option inside the iOS version of the game, specifically to bypass Apple's 30% fee. Within hours, Apple pulled Fortnite from the App Store. That decision triggered a high-profile legal battle that stretched over years and forced the courts to examine whether Apple's strict ecosystem was protecting users or simply preserving profit? To make matters worse for Apple, Epic deliberately turned the dispute into a spectacle. It released a parody ad modeled after Apple's own famous 1984 commercial, framing Apple as the authoritarian giant it once claimed to fight. The stunt went viral, and while Apple fought to maintain its policies in court, its reputation took a hit in public opinion. The trial made visible tensions that had been brewing for years. Apple insisted that its system was about privacy, security, and maintaining the integrity of its platform. It argued that sideloading apps or alternative payment systems would open the door to fraud and malware. Critics countered that the real motivation was profit protection, pointing out how inconsistently rules were enforced. Some large partners were given exceptions, while smaller developers remained bound to full commission rates. What looked like defending the garden from Apple's perspective began to look like selective enforcement and profiteering to others. Tim Cook himself took the stand, an extraordinary moment in which Apple's CEO personally defended the App Store model under oath. He maintained that Apple's approach kept users safe and delivered value, but lawyers pressed him on whether the structure was tilted in Apple's financial favor. For a company that had spent decades tightly managing its public image, seeing its leader grilled about whether Apple was exploiting its position left a lasting impression. The court case did not happen in isolation. Around the same time, regulators in Europe, the United States, and Asia were already raising questions about Apple's practices. Laws were proposed to open up ecosystems, cap commissions, and require fairer terms for developers. Even when Apple avoided outright defeats, the perception shifted. The App Store was no longer shorthand for innovation, but a case study in corporate dominance. Governments began treating Apple much less like an admired pioneer and much more like a monopoly to be restrained. For consumers, the ripple effects were subtle, but real. Developers often raised prices to offset Apple's fees, meaning users paid more for subscriptions or received less value inside apps. Certain services chose to withhold features or skip Apple's platform altogether because the economics didn't work. The reputational fallout reached further than the courtroom. Apple had long styled itself as a champion of creators, artists, developers, and thinkers who used its tools to bring new ideas to life. The legal clashes with Epic made it look instead like Apple was extracting value from those creators, rather than enabling them. To many onlookers, what once felt like partnership began to look like exploitation. The 1984 parody ad sharpened that image, flipping Apple's historic stance against conformity into a portrait of Apple itself as the enforcer. Even customers not directly affected by app pricing began to question whether Apple's dominance was still a net positive. Apple's defense still resonates with some, particularly those who prize stability. Many users do in fact appreciate an app store where apps are less likely to carry scams or malware. But once the financial stakes were made explicit, trust weakened. The narrative shifted from Apple as a company protecting its users to Apple as a corporate giant defending a revenue stream. What these battles showed was clear. Apple no longer depended only on bold new products to project power. The strength now came from controlling access to the platform itself, with every developer compelled to play by Apple's rules. And as this picture spread, Apple's reputation as a fearless innovator gave way to its image as a corporate gatekeeper. That transformation mattered not only in courtrooms, but also on Wall Street, where investors started weighing whether future growth would look as resilient as the company's past. iOS 17 drew heavy criticism for draining battery life, while iOS 18 was widely mocked for clumsy redesigns that disrupted usability. For a company that once set the quality benchmark, public reaction to these updates revealed a growing sense that Apple devices no longer deliver the polish customers had come to expect. Even Apple's global reach has limits. In wealthy markets, long-time loyalty softens the blow. But in emerging regions such as India, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa, where local competitors push aggressively on features and pricing, Apple struggles more visibly. Its devices remain aspirational, but priced beyond the reach of the majority. Meanwhile, Chinese firms continue to refine advanced camera technology, fast charging, and flexible designs at lower costs. That competitive contrast undermines Apple's aura as the undisputed driver of progress. These cracks matter because much of Apple's identity has never been purely about technology. It has always been about perception. A company that convinced people its future was inevitable, enjoyed a shield other brands did not. When buyers thought Apple could not fail, they paid more, upgraded sooner, remained loyal, and granted the company enormous cultural influence. When investors believed growth was automatic, they allowed Apple to chart long-term paths without fear. But once doubt enters, whether sparked by sluggish iPhones, controversial software updates, or weaker international traction, it compounds. Confidence is much harder to rebuild than it is to lose. Right now, the picture is two-sided. Apple still manufactures some of the most profitable devices in the world, still commands a massive ecosystem, and still draws headlines with each release. But profitability and reach are not the same as influence. What is fading is the sense that Apple sets the agenda for technology's future. The Apple Car project is a case in point. It consumed years of speculation and huge amounts of capital. Reports suggest billions were invested before winding down without a product. The Vision Pro headset, another attempt at breaking into a new category, was positioned as the next leap in computing, but landed as an expensive, niche product that failed to capture mainstream momentum. These examples highlight the gap between vast resources and actual breakthroughs. They make clear that throwing money and manpower at a challenge is not the same as generating widespread cultural impact. This cycle erodes patience. For years, users gave Apple the benefit of the doubt, trusting delays as signs of meticulous refinement. But after multiple efforts that underperform, or projects that vanish entirely, the idea of waiting for perfection feels less convincing. What once fueled loyalty now risks becoming fatigue. Each underwhelming launch reduces the tolerance fans once had for long silences or vague promises. Apple's past strength came from bold bets that put customers first and earned extraordinary trust. That foundation is what turned products like the iPod and iPhone into cultural milestones. Today, though, a shift toward subscription revenue, strict platform control, and incremental updates has eroded much of that trust and reshaped how people view the company. A brand built on vision depends on customers believing in that vision. This is why Apple's story matters beyond tech headlines. It shows what happens when a company trades risk and imagination for safety. Do you think Apple can rebuild that trust? Tell us why in the comments and which Apple product you'd most like to see reinvented.